Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. Today we are joined by Richard Jackson from GateSafe, who will be talking to you about being GateSafe aware. If you have any questions, pop them into the question box and we will have a chance for a question and answer session at the end. Okay, I'm going to hand over to you now, Richard.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a very quick run through of the issues around automatic gates. So without further ado, let's get started. GateSafe was formed back in 2010 after there were two children killed tragically in accidents about 3 weeks apart. And it became very obvious that there was a huge lack of understanding what was required to make an automatic gate. Looking into the matter, we tried to look at the legislation and the standards, and they were far from clear, to say the least. And we set about putting guidance together in plain English that most people could understand readily, rather than the what can be almost gobbledygook in the British standards. To date, we've trained over 2,800 installers. They've gone through the training course that's IOSH approved, and we're aiming to raise awareness of the critical issues around electric gates and gates in general. Looking at the logos before, you can see we've got a wide range of followers that are supporting the campaign. One that isn't actually on that list is the Health and Safety Executive. In a relatively recent survey, we looked at 100 gates. Of those, there were 86 swing gates and 14 sliding gates. And out of that 100, there was only 1% compliant, or to put it the other way around, 99% weren't compliant. Of the swing gates, only 10% had hinge protection, which is the area of the gates that has the most force when it's opening and closing, has been responsible for 1 death and many near misses. And only 28% had photocells on both sides of the gate. That means when you come to the gate from one way, the photocell will see you and stop you getting into danger. But if you come from the other side, you have no protection at all. And then of the sliding gates, there were only 21 had pressure edges on the leading edge, which is the area that was effectively the killer for the Somalia and Carolina, and only 11% had drawing in protection, which are areas, again, that we've seen numerous accidents and near misses. In terms of the accidents, we had Jason Keats that was killed back in 26, and the equipment manufacturer there was fined £120,000. Samelia Campbell in Manchester in 2010, the installation was charged with corporate manslaughter and fined £50,000 and had a publicity order placed against them. Carolina Golobeck in Bridgend was the second fatality that year, and the installer had £110,000 and a £90,000 rather fine for the maintenance company. Then further on in 2013, Jill Lunn was killed in Norwich, and the company there was fined £12,000, but the installer that actually fitted the gate was given a 42-month custodial sentence for manslaughter by gross negligence. And Heidi Chalkley in Cambridge again died in 2016. There was a fine of £25,000 there and £6,500. So that shows quite clearly that there are substantial penalties for any failing in terms of the safety of gates, and also the issues around the reputation of the company that's installing them. In recent, or rather since 2010, in terms of automatic gate instances, there have been 13 accidents and a further 4 fatalities. That's due to the automation. In addition to that, there have been 15 accidents where gates have fallen on them. This is down to poor construction or poor design, and a further 5 fatalities. So in terms of the accidents that we're aware of, and we're only aware of the ones that make the press, falling gates actually are arguably more of a risk than an automatic gate. In terms of the regulations, they are straightforward and simple. The machinery directive requires that any machine has to comply with the legislation, and essentially it has to be safe. To put that into context, a machine in the context of a gate is the posts, the gate, the equipment that makes it move forward and backwards, the intercom, radio control, whatever to open it. And it's a combination of all of those things that make a machine. So as soon as you put them all together, you are effectively the manufacturer of the machine. As such, it's got to be safe, as I said, and it also has to meet the essential health and safety requirements. In terms of the health and safety requirements, the machinery regulations detail the technical requirements for all machinery, therefore including automatic gates and barriers, and you have to reduce the risk by design. If you dwell on that for a moment, if you have a gate that doesn't have a closing gap around the hinge, you don't have to protect that gap. So anything that can be designed out in terms of the manufacturer is far better than putting measures in place to protect it. It also says that risks have to be covered that are omitted by the British standards. And along with this statement, it's also valid that the HSC acknowledge that following the standards won't necessarily supply a safe installation, which is the areas that GateSafe has tried to focus on, as well as the major issues in the standards. In terms of the gate, when it is installed and commissioned, it should have the following documentations. It should be marked with a UKCA or a CE mark. That has to be fitted onto the gate or the machine. There has to be a declaration of conformity from the manufacturer or the installer of the gate. It should also give training, or they should also give training to how to put the gate into manual and what simple operations are needed to maintain it, clearing debris from a track or whatever. And there should also be a service schedule. Again, just looking at the legislation, you've got the Supply of Machinery and Safety Regulations 2008. And the person that's responsible there is a manufacturer stroke installer of the electric gates. So that would be when the gates initially put in. The Health and Safety at Work Act says any employee must be able to work in a safe environment. So in that situation, it would be the employer or someone that is self-employed that would be responsible for the safety of the gate. And then the Workplace Health and Safety and Welfare Regulations state that the person responsible for the workplace would be responsible. Essentially, that's saying that any gate or any machine has to be safe for anyone in and around it. In terms of the British standards, there are numerous standards that are associated with the gates and machines, over 50 at the last count, and to understand them all is fairly daunting. But if we look at the main areas, you've got BS 12453, and that identifies the risks. As stated there, you've got the risk of impact, so you're coming or going through the gate and the gate hits you. You've got the risk of crushing. So again, perhaps you're coming or going through the gate and the gate pushes you into a solid object. This was the area where Samelia and Carolina were tragically killed. They were caught in between the gate and the shutting post. You've got shearing, two edges coming by one another that create a shearing action, similar to a cutting where you've got a sharp edge coming to a blunt edge in the operation of the gate. Then you've got dragging and drawing in. This is more specific for sliding gates, where a gate might be sliding through a support post. You could get caught and pulled into the support post by the gate. And then the actual fabrication of the gate, are there any areas where you could physically get hooked and dragged into the gate? So those are the 6 risks detailed in sort of relatively straightforward terms. But then those risks have to be considered when you're looking at a gate and working out how to protect it and doing a risk assessment. In addition to those risks, there are other risks. You could create an entrapment hazard where, when the gate operates, it perhaps traps someone so they can't get in or out. You've got risk of electrical failure, fire, electrocution, and then mechanical failure, which we touched on earlier. Will any part of the gate fall, and could that cause injury? In the case of a sliding gate, could it derail? And then with most swing gates, you'll have trip hazards. They need to be kept to a minimum, always clearly visible, highlighted with high-vis paint or similar. And pedestrians should always be segregated from vehicle entrance. And lastly, climbing aids. There never should be any climbing aids in or around the gate that could encourage someone to climb on the gate, where it could be activated and then be drawn into the top of the gate or similar. Next standard we're looking at is 12604, and it says that all garage gates should be capable of being installed, maintained, and used in a safe manner. The most important part of this is the next paragraph. The failure of one component should not lead to a catastrophic failure of the gate, i.e. if a hinge breaks, the gate should not fall or be able to cause injury. And that's the main area where the fatalities that we talked about earlier have occurred. Similarly, on sliding gates, where they have one support post holding the gate vertical on one bracket, if that fails for whatever reason, the whole sliding gate can fall over. Or if the end stops aren't in place or strong enough, again, it can run through itself and again fall. External factors have to be taken into consideration, such as wind, snow and ice, etc. On a sliding gate, if ice were to build up around the track, it may not follow the course that the track intended it to, causing derailment or it dropping. And then finally, you've got the maximum force. On a manual gate, you shouldn't have to exert a force of more than 260 newtons, which roughly equates to 26 kilos to operate the gate. And if it does, other methods need to be employed to ensure that you're not using too much force and it could overpower you. Again, dwelling on the single point failure, 3 hinges are recommended for single gates, and the picture to the right shows why. The gate there has been installed for a number of years, I would imagine, and had little or no maintenance. And you can see that the pin and the eye have half worn through. Well, it will only be a matter of time before that actually fails. If that were to fail, it would almost certainly result in a falling, because the weight of the hinge will be on the top hinge in that situation, which means that's the one that's going to stop it falling. If a gate hasn't been manufactured with 3 hinges, there's a simple resolution to that. A gate tether can be fitted, and that's a simple strop that goes around the gate and is bolted back to a post or a wall. So in the event that the gate does have the hinge fail, the strop will catch it, and that should be fitted in such a way that it doesn't travel any more than 100 millimeters. In terms of sliding gates, end stops in the fully open and closed position should be fitted, and they are very important. Similarly on swing gates, so it can't over open and tear the hinges. Another common failing is that people will invert hinges on gates, on swing gates, for security reasons, so they can't be lifted off. Again, if there is a failure, an inverted hinge will do nothing to support the gate. And then anti-tamper fixings should be used to prevent any fiddling with gate tethers, etc. Moving on to gaps. On sliding gates, you will very often have a gate moving past a fence or similar. And if that's a vertical railing gate, it's quite feasible that you could reach through a fence and through the gate and be caught in a scissor action. So there are distances that are safe that you can reach through with your fingers, which would be 120 millimeters. And for that, you need a mesh of 18.5 millimeters. If you've got a 300 millimeter gap, you would need a mesh of 29 millimeters, and a 500 millimeter gap, 44 millimeters. And then ultimately, if you've got an 850 millimeter gap, you can have a 100 millimeter gap between the mesh. So if you haven't got the required standoff on the sliding gate, you need to mesh the fence or the gate to prevent hands or fingers passing through. Similarly, you've got the vertical gaps between palings on gates, and they should be a maximum of 100 millimeter gap. The reason for that is that 100 millimeters is the gap that a small person can get their head through, or can't get their head through, to be more precise. And it's within Part K of the building regulations. So any gap of more than 100 millimeters needs to be protected either by mesh or electronic means. Similarly, under the gate, if you've got a sloped entrance, you need to be able to have the gap there of less than 100 millimeters, or again, there's a risk of someone getting under it and being caught if it operates. The risk assessment is probably the most important part of the talk that we're going to do today. If we look at this pair of swing gates, you've got various areas where the risks are going to occur. If you look at point A, as the gate opens, that will come apart, but as it closes, the two edges will come together. So you've got a risk of impact and crushing there. At B, in the arc of the gate, as the gate's opening, it could catch someone in between the sort of dead area between the photocells and the gate itself, and again create an impact or crushing hazard. This is both relevant on the opening and closing phase, so if it can hit you at opening, almost certainly can hit you closing as well. Then D, the risk of crushing in between the gate and the gate post as it opens. If you look at that gap there, there's something like 120, 130 millimeter gap between the post and the gate. And when that comes to a fully open position, that will be down to practically zero. So you can imagine how catastrophic that will be if someone had their hands or whatever between there. And then finally, you've got the risk of dragging under the gate. So if someone were to fall, which has happened, they could be dragged under the gate. Looking at that picture there, it's got a safety edge about 300 to 400 millimeters from the bottom of the gate. Now that clearly wouldn't protect anyone that had fallen over. That edge should be at the bottom of the gate to protect the area that's most likely to hurt you. If we move on to a sliding gate, again, you've got risk of impact and crushing at A. Bearing in mind you've got the same risk when it's opening as you have closing, so there are two A's. You've got the risk of being sheared in between the gate and the support posts. If you look closely at that picture, you'll see that there's mesh in between the two support posts, preventing that risk. At D, you've got risk of being drawing in. As the gate closes or opens, it will move through those support posts. And if someone were to be standing on the gate, they would be dragged into that. And again, if you look closely, you can see a pressure edge on the support post, the black line in between the D and E line. That should be placed ideally less than 100 millimeters from the center line. And in that situation, that would prevent or would see someone that was riding on the gate and would stop and reverse the gate before any injury occurred. And then finally, you've got the risk of being dragged underneath the gate. So if that's on an unlevel site, that could easily drag someone in. And the final is F, where you've got a risk of being drawn in around the motor. And again, the mesh is protecting from that risk. Barriers, again, you've got risk of impact and crushing as you walk underneath them. One of the areas of real risk with barriers, if you're walking through into a car park, you're looking forward. In that situation, now you'd be looking at the cars, looking to see if cars coming around the corner. You wouldn't immediately think to look above you. So the chance of seeing that barrier as it comes down, if it were to come down when you're walking through, are pretty remote. Simple solution there is photocells looking either side of the gate underneath the barrier. And then you've also got the risk of shearing between the moving arm and the cabinet itself. When it's in the vertical position, that will come down and you've got a shearing risk there, and also as it comes into the catch post. On bifolding gates, these are essentially the same as swing gates, but you have two leaves that then fold in on themselves. So you've got the crushing as they come together. You've also got the risk of the crushing in between the two leaves as they fold together. You've got the risk around the hinge point. You've also got a risk around the bottom of the gate and in the top. Point F is where the drive motor is. So if that is in a position where little fingers or big fingers can get, that also needs to be protected. In terms of safety devices that you can put on, again, to reiterate, if you can design out a risk, that's the best way forward, because any electronic device will fail at some point, whereas a good design won't. So to do the exercise, you need to do a multiple risk assessment. So you look at the gate, you look at the way it's made, you look at the situation it's in, and you would then install at least 2 different types of safety device around that gate. Non-contact will be gate safe's preferred method, so the gate stops and moves away from you before it actually fits. So that's it hits. So that would be photocells, light curtains or laser scanners. Those can be fitted, so as I said earlier, they will see you and they will stop the gate coming into contact with you. If those have been fitted, you also need to look at other methods. Safety edges, typically. I talked earlier about the dead zone in between the gate and the photocells when it's opening and closing. They should be fitted at the bottom of the gate, so they are protecting that. And again, around the hinge area, if that hasn't been protected in other ways. Another method that can be employed that we have concerns with is false limitation. A lot of people will say that the gate is fitted with false limitation on the control board, which it may well be, but false limitation only is measured on the leading edge of the gate. So on a swing gate that's 4 meters long, you may comply with the false limitation, but as you move closer and closer to the hinge, that force is magnified. So at the actual hinge point itself, what can easily be stopped with a finger at the leading edge will crush you and cause severe injury around the hinge. Again, to reiterate, non-contact is the way forward, so photocells should be installed on every installation inside and out. And then finally, you've got the control equipment. That should be placed at a minimum of 1.5 meters away from the gate to stop people reaching through from the wrong side to try and open the gate. Again, an area where someone has sadly been killed. If that can't be fitted far enough away, it needs to be shrouded in such a way that you can't put your fingers through. Maintenance is the final piece of the jigsaw. It's all very well supplying and installing a gate that's safe, but it also needs to be maintained in the same way that your car would need to be maintained. It's a legal requirement under the Health and Safety at Work Act for gates to be maintained, and we would recommend that checks are carried out 6 monthly. When you are doing, or when the installation company is doing a risk assessment, a maintenance operation, it also gives them the opportunity to do a further risk assessment. Very often we find that a gate's been installed and then subsequently we'd have been installed or something's been fitted that changes the risks around the gate. So maintenance also gives you an opportunity to check that the circumstances surrounding the gate haven't changed the risk. And then finally, GateSafe would recommend that you have a GateSafe MOT sticker fitted to the gate, showing the date that it was serviced and who serviced it, and to act as a reminder to anyone to get the maintenance done next time round. In terms of the legal position, you've got responsibility versus liability. If we take the Norwich case that I mentioned earlier, it was the actual installer that was found liable there because the installation company had issued instructions and the installer hadn't followed them through. In the case of Samedio, Campbell and Carolina, it was the installation company and the maintenance company that were found liable. In addition to the actual court costs, you also have long-term damage that will affect the company doing the install. If a company has been subject to a criminal prosecution, it won't do their reputation any good. Then finally, you've got the difference between a civil claim and a criminal claim. Even if criminal charges aren't brought, it's quite possible a civil claim could be brought. And the chance of a civil claim winning compared with a criminal claim are substantially higher because a civil claim only has to be on the balance of probability that someone was guilty, whereas against criminal is beyond reasonable doubt. Often I hear, or we hear, you know, don't fit the safety devices. I'll give you a disclaimer. That just will not wash. You as the operators of gates are seen to be experts and you should be protecting your users. So it's essential that you do comply with the machinery regulations and never knowingly have an unsafe gate on your property. That's it. I hope you found that useful, and if you've got any questions, just fire away, and hopefully I'll get.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I have had a few questions coming through. So the first one is, what is the most common failing in the installation of automatic gates?
Design would be the main failing. If the gate isn't designed right in the first place, it's very hard for any installer to sort of make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, who would be liable in the event of an accident on a gated community development?
Yeah, in a gated community, the gate would be, as I said earlier, a machine, and that machine should be safe, and it would be the operator or the property manager that would be maintaining that, and therefore almost certainly they would be seen to be liable, and that would be followed up by HSE because it would be considered a workplace rather than a domestic residence.
Okay, thank you. Do the regulations apply to garage doors?
Yes, they do. We are not experts in garage doors, and garage doors aren't similar to the same problems gates have because they're not subject to the elements. But again, it will be considered a machine and it has to be safe.
Okay, thank you. If the gates do not meet the safety standards, the gates do not meet safety standards, so the gates have been powered down, is there still liability, or what action should we take?
Well, if the gate's been powered down, that can be left unpowered and there's no problem there. The only problem is going to be if there's an accident, and that won't happen if it's powered down. The only proviso I'd make on that is that the gate has to be secured, so there can't be free motion, you know, so if it's a swing gate, it's not blowing in the breeze, as it were. And there's also, ultimately, sorry, one more thing on that. There is also still the risk of a single point failure. If it's a very large gate that perhaps is holding a lot of wind, the single point failure could still be an issue.
Okay, thank you. Last question that's come through. So as a letting and property management agency, are we as the agent responsible for ensuring risk assessments are carried out and ensuring all the safety regs are complied with?
You'd be responsible for ensuring the maintenance is carried out. If you are using a reputable company to do the maintenance, they should be doing the risk assessment on your behalf. But that does mean that you need to be sure that the company that's doing the maintenance is fully qualified. If you go on the GateSafe website, there are a list of installers who've done the training, and hopefully they will be qualified to install adequately for you, maintain adequately for you even.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That's everything that's come in. So I'll end that there. Thanks, Richard, and thank you for everyone for watching. If you do want to watch anything back, the recording will be sent to you shortly. Okay, I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.